Okay, fantastic. Thank you. It's great to see you, Ralph. It's been a while. You and I last spoke. At least seeing each other like this. We all know what's been happening over the past year around the world with the pandemic and all that. That has, changed our lives in many, many ways. So, I mean, it's great to catch up. It's great to see you, Dr. Ralph Mathekga. You are the doctor now. But tell me about that, the experience of your PhD and the title of being a doctor. How does it feel, man?
Great talking to you, my friend. It's been a while indeed. I mean, since we last sat down, I remember when we last had coffee, it was a different world altogether.
Yeah, different world, man.
Yeah, things have changed dramatically. We work from home. I mean, some of us have been working from home for a while, but for majority, it has become a norm. And it's a great pleasure to be talking to you. And I think during the time when people work from home, I think a lot of people will do a lot of writing. I'm hoping, write their thesis and so forth. Yeah. My experience was quite an interesting one, writing my thesis. I work on law and politics, having one foot in legal subject and one foot in political science. So it's been quite interesting looking at the courts, how some of the key decisions are coming out in the Constitutional Court in relation to affirmative action. I mean, that's a huge policy matter here that I think is a source of contest. So it was just interesting engaging those things, and now looking at the interest that South Africans are taking when it comes to the courts, the role of the judiciary, it all comes to bear for me now that I think something interesting is worth observing. What's going on? How do we reflect on the courts? How do we interact with the courts thereof? So it's within that context.
So it's you've been busy. Is what you are telling me?
Well, I like to read. I always try to do that, and I easily get bored. So I'm always working on writing. I'm always trying. If I'm not doing columns, I'm working on a book. But sometimes I want to allow people to read before I can do something else, because I've got a feeling that I've got an idea in my mind, but it hasn't been that far back that I've contributed something. Let me wait and allow people. I get frustrated. If I could, I could write all the time and get these things out, because I just sit and think.
No, great, man. We appreciate your voice. Ralph, I want to talk about your book. That this is your new latest book that you have written. The title is The ANC's Last Decade, and the subtitle is How the Decline of the Party Will Transform South Africa. What motivated you to sit down, devote your energy, think on a daily basis, for you to write this book? What motivated you?
I mean, I started writing towards the end of last year, and the thought came from the observation, you correctly point out, about the ANC, what is happening in government. And when I looked at how the ANC is holding, quite often I listen to South Africans, I hear the desperation. I mean, we have coined many terms around the ANC as the broader society. And those terms and ways of trying to understand and expectations, expression of expectations, there is this idea of self-correction, where we believe that the ANC will self-correct because of why is it that we believe that? I mean, if you listen to our criticism of this party, it often nostalgic. There is a sense of people saying, we know of the great ANC, but no one never knew about the great ANC in government, by the way. The ANC that we know about is the ANC that has led the liberation movement. It has been that great ANC we know. But the ANC in government, it's a different picture, complex picture. The ANC is struggling, and the party is actually nearly closing in on the third decade in power. And the hypothesis is that most of the liberation parties that have governed in the region, Southern Africa, in the region, the SADC, your Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, sometimes they tend to fizzle out. They fall out with the people after 30 years. Why? Is because they are unable to transform themselves from liberation parties, the culture of liberation parties, to becoming modern parties that actually govern a modern state with where people multiracial and different identities and different interests, governing a complex society that you cannot define with an issue such as the national question, for example. I mean, if you coin the idea of the national question where you're governing this, multifaceted society, it cannot be as the ANC went about it, as if everybody agrees with it. So liberation parties like the ANC, they struggle, they fall out. When I apply this back to South Africa and I say, we're not exceptional. And remember, we have this idea that South Africa is exceptional. But in most cases, when you look at our political culture, you look at a lot of things. You and I, we travel across the continent. We see that there are a lot of comparison from what's happening in other countries on the continent and what's happening in South Africa, the liberation parties, the experience. Of course, there is a differences in terms of the scale. What ZANU-PF can pull in Zimbabwe is not what the ANC can pull, but the thinking sometimes can be the same. The ANC here will have to be careful that, here's a different game. Then when I look at that, my view then said to me, I should begin to understand how South Africans are going to survive without the ANC. I know South Africans are not ready for that. I'm not propagating that, but it's inevitable. If you look at where the ANC is, I then came up with this idea that this last decade, I mean, when we decided on the title, the president had not spoken about the decade of renewal after the step aside thing, but the parties coming out with that, recognizing that they are in a crunch time. Are they going to survive, renew themselves? For me, it's impossible. I don't see that. I don't see the ANC regaining that hegemony. So in this last decade, it is the last decade of the hegemony of the ANC. It is the last decade of the domination of the ANC. The ANC is facing serious electoral decline whereby it could fail to constitute government outright at national government in the next election. It's not unthinkable. If you start thinking about what will happen in the next elective conference of the ANC or what might happen, you really consider that there is such a possibility. So this is a very critical decade. But for South Africans, the view is, can they survive? How much captivated are we by the ANC and so forth?
Yeah. Just, tell me something, Ralph. In the ANC has been, over the past decades, right? It has been praised and admired for its struggle against apartheid, right? Mm-hmm. And then 1994 came, we got the democracy. And my question to you is, do you think over the past 27 years now of our democracy, that the ANC, would you say that the ANC was good at liberating the Black people, but terrible in governance, right? Have they been bad in governance, that they couldn't get how to govern a multiracial, diverse society like ours? They struggled with governance. They were good in liberating, the majority in the country, but some people will say that they were terrible in governance. They could not govern a democratic society. Is that your view?
Exactly, I share that. I would not say they failed.
Yeah.
I would say, and you used a very interesting word here, that they're struggling.
Struggled, yeah.
And the struggle is genuine. I mean, corruption is a symptom of a struggle. It's not the cause of their struggle. What we see as corruption, the failure, all of these lapses, for me, those are the symptoms as to why I argue in the book that the ANC, because of its character as a liberation party, it is inherently not well wired to become a good governing party in a democratic society.
In a democratic society.
And if I were to compare actually across, the ANC comes out top. Of all most liberation parties, it has made the best attempt on trying to transform itself from a liberation party to a modern institutionalized party. I mean, the things that are happening within the ANC, I'm very critical of the ANC, but I have a sense of context that if you compare them with ZANU-PF, you compare them with the BDP in Botswana, you compare them with Mozambique, you compare them with SWAPO in Namibia, you go on. The ANC comes out actually as one of the best liberation parties of its time. And it has made a very meaningful attempt, but it's not enough. And that is why the struggle persists. I mean, there are genuine, there are those within the ANC that are seeing these things and are trying to transform the party, but they are marching against an entrenched culture. An entrenched culture that if you transform it, there just might be little of the ANC left behind that attracts the people to go to. Particularly, when I talk about the people, I'm talking about its traditional core constituents, cadreship for that matter. So it's a genuine struggle, and the ANC will never come out of it the same. The transformation that we're talking about, currently there are attempts to transform the ANC. Those attempts.
The renewal. They call
the renewal.
Yeah.
Yes, the renewal. What will be the result of that renewal? People tend to think that the result is the ANC of Mandela coming back with the hegemony. No, the society will never have that. There is also something about how the ANC shapes up that has to do with the attitudes of South Africans as well. South Africans are also changing. South Africans are also evolving. I mean, who would have thought that this country, you can have a party other than the ANC running the city of Johannesburg, running the city of Tshwane. Those are the major cities, and the country did not necessarily bend down. Even if those parties and coalitions that were running those cities did not succeed, there was some major interruption. I don't see the ANC as a bad loser, by the way. The ANC disrupt democratically. They go and disrupt a council, motion of no confidence, but they don't go out there and say that you will not enter council because we believe we are inherently there to govern. They don't start killing people. Sadly, they are killing some comrades regarding what's happening at the local government level with the candidate. But it doesn't go to the point where one can say they exercise those extrajudicial measures to try to be in power. So comparing them, they come out well. But they will never come out, in my view, to a point where they can become hegemonic. Also because it's just impossible. As a liberation party, they are always held by some of the characters of the liberation that just don't fit very well. The whole idea of the national question, is framed in a way that it's visually understood by the liberation parties, and the liberation parties become the custodian, the vanguard of those things. But that's in a democracy, the national question has to be debated by the people. It cannot be left to be one man or one woman's purview. It is all of us. We negotiated what constitutes the national question today, or it is development, it is that. It's not in the same way where the governing party, Liberation Party, appropriate the national question. Those are characters that makes it very difficult. Look at the relationship that the party has with the judiciary. Beneath the tension of the irritation that the ANC is having with the judiciary, it's deeply the question as to whether should the judiciary second-hand the transformation agenda of the ANC. What happens when the court says that you cannot implement affirmative action because it's against the right? The ANC goes and says, but nobody voted for you. We have this. Those are genuine questions. Unfortunately, they come through sinister people. But sometimes those are questions that inherently makes it very difficult for liberation parties to transform themselves seamlessly into modern governing parties.
Now, in this book here, Ralph, there's something you point out here. You are saying that, in the ANC, the ANC tends to have an issue with criticism, right? It doesn't want to be criticized, even internally. Then there is this thing that if you criticize their policies, they are going to call you names, ostracize you, do whatever. And if you are within the party, they will somehow dislodge you. There will be forces that push against you. What does that mean for the party? This thing of their refusal or their pushback against any criticism.
This actually opens the party for a takeover by sinister groups, or it opens the party for capture, if we like, the term that we tend to use recently in South Africa. Because if you cannot debate ideas within a party, it actually means you are going to believe there is someone else who possesses the utmost truth. And how do you determine and know who possesses the utmost truth about what is a position worth justifying within the party? I mean, for example, the whole idea of expropriation of land without compensation, did they debate it? Did they try to refine it? Or did they just decide that this is a position, we are sticking to it, we are not going to debate it, we are not going to look in, we are going to just implement it? Where does it come from? They're saying it is the resolution of the party, it comes from the... How those resolutions have been made? Are they open discussions within the party? What level of consultation actually takes place across the party structure so that issues can shape into those resolutions, into those issues? So the manner in which the policy is being processed, positions have been taken, it essentially means that the ANC agenda has to be protected from sinister groups outside. There is this belief that the ANC's programs are facing the greater risk outside the ANC, therefore they have to be protected from criticism. My view is that the biggest enemy when it comes to the risk that the ANC agenda is facing, it's the internal processes that does not even allow criticism, because it allows a few to dominate and tell everybody else what the party's position is without having to justify themselves. You can't carry on with this in a modern society. You cannot tell me in a modern society that the only justification why a policy has to be implemented is because it's just supported by majority. That's poor reasoning. It also has to be rational. That is why we are a constitutional democracy, whereby the constitution will also, court will also determine by looking at the rationality of the laws to make sure that you don't end up with what people call the dictatorship of the majority.
Yeah,
which is
I think that's a very important point to make. You know, because there are things that even though the majority of the people don't like, but they need to be upheld. For example, the gay rights. I assure you, Ralph, if you were to do on gay rights, like gay rights, if you were to do a poll in South Africa asking people, do they favor, you know, the open laws around gay rights, the rights of the gay? The majority will say no, but the Constitution says we need to uphold that. So, so I'm supporting your point, the point you make here.
Yeah, and again, it is the role of the Constitution in a democracy. Remember, in a democracy, the idea of majority, in a proper functioning political order, the majority is supposed to be temporary. You and I, we can constitute majority upon an issue. It should not make us a permanent majority. So if I say I represent a majority today, it is majority around the issues. It does not create an absolute truth whereby I cannot even listen to the minority of today. So the majority of today can be the minority of tomorrow. We have to come up with a system that ensures that everybody else survives. Democracy is not about just the majority, it's about the coexistence across the society.
Yeah. Now in chapter 5, it's titled "Paralyzed by an Economic War." I found it very interesting, and your opening lines, they made me think, you know, around the fact that the treasury. You say that the treasury, led by Tito Mboweni, when you wrote, Tito Mboweni was still the finance minister. It's Enoch Godongwana now. You are saying that it is the most closely aligned with Ramaphosa's thinking on the need for economic changes. You are saying, is it the only department that is mostly aligned with Ramaphosa? But what does this mean? Does this mean that, let's remember that the treasury is a very powerful institution. Right. You know, it determines where do we spend, you know, the collections, and where do we spend, and how do we basically, how it manages our budget, our finances. That's what it is. Do you think that this close-up or this good relationship between the treasury and the presidency, is there an opportunity? Is it something that could be used quite more effectively to bring about economic reform in the country?
Let me disclose, and I always disclose in my bio that I worked for Treasury. So I think I worked there as a senior policy analyst.
You worked?
I used to work there back 2010 or so. Okay. Yes, I used to work in the budget office at National Treasury. And during that time, I was in budget reform, looking at budget, national budget, and so forth. And one of the things that came to my mind that I started realizing during that time is how the public service is clustered, how government departments are clustered. You know, you have got the security cluster, which is your defense, your correctional services, your police. You have got the economic cluster, public enterprises, treasury, public works, perhaps. You have got your social and so forth. And if you look at these clusters of the departments, needless to say, the security is the one that always more important, is the one that attracts a lot of political attention because of the importance of security and intelligence in political stability. And in our context, look at the manner in which the security cluster has been brought forth in the fight within the ANC, SAPS, and so forth. Concentration of fights there. The economic cluster is important in a sense that it is usually the department you look at if you want to understand the administration's economic agenda. And it's about the people who get appointed there. It's about how the department relates to the head of the executive, which is the president. I mean, the president's biggest agenda is the economic agenda, of course, which will make sure the social and other education and other agendas, how they are being funded and so forth. We need money to fund just about everything. So that is why when you look at that, I'm not denoting the hierarchy of the departments, but money is very much important. So you need to make sure the president's agenda is well aligned with someone at Treasury to fund. I mean, imagine if you're the president, you want to fund education, you're not in line with your minister at the Treasury, who just point to saying that, look, we don't have money for that. It will result in the runaway debt and whatever it is. You always want to make sure there is that alignment. My understanding is that during Mboweni and Ramaphosa's term, well, President Ramaphosa still there, of course, but during a minister's term, we have seen that alignment. Remember the Treasury issuing a document without even consulting with alliance partners out there, the 56-pager on reforms. Treasury actually in that way almost made it very clear that these reforms have become an essential mandate of Treasury, which is what is given to Treasury under the Constitution, I think somewhere down section 200, to manage the money. So Treasury is actually saying that these reforms are not political, people. We need this thing as the technicalities of the budget, this reform. And the president wants that. So it's very much important to see that. I see Treasury as a department that has been struggling with other departments to achieve that.
Yeah, but you know, here's what this is my observation, Ralph, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong here. You are right. And my view is that the Treasury and the Reserve Bank, they tend to be sensible, right, on what we need to do to move the country or to reboot the economy. And then, of course, they get a pushback from various ANC affiliates, from COSATU to SACP and RET and so on. And the policy document you speak of, you talk about it on page 66, which was called Economic Transformation, Inclusive Growth and Competitiveness towards an Economic Strategy for South Africa, right? Which was published, the Treasury published it in August 2019.
Yeah.
What I noticed, Ralph, at least in my observation, was that the president of South Africa, Ramaphosa, really doesn't give that strong public support to the Treasury, or let me say, to Tito Mboweni when he was there. Tito Mboweni will say, at one point, Tito wrote something that was very interesting, where he said, he wrote on Business Day, if I'm not mistaken, where he said that we cannot continuously try to spend our way out. You know, we've got to reform for better economic growth, right? So ideas like that, the public sector wage bill, which is very, very controversial with labor unions. He has spoken about the necessity to make reforms there. And you know, this document that you mentioned in your book that you just spoken about. But I didn't see Ramaphosa coming out publicly and saying, this policy that is being proposed by the Treasury, I'm in support of it. Or I believe these are nice ideas to reboot the economy. He doesn't publicly do it, Ralph. Am I wrong to observe that? And if it doesn't, why is that? Why does it do it publicly?
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's a political balance. Remember, the president is sitting on precarious power balance, if you like, power base, if you like. The president beginning to consolidate a little bit recently around step aside implementation, some of his detractors almost losing the moral war, those who were pushing against some of those reforms. But there are still alliance partners as well who have actually criticized Treasury for making those proposals, including the public sector wage bill you are talking about. The unions have said that we are going to hit the street if you go ahead with this thing.
Yes,
it's also because they don't want that, but they're also very observant that, morally speaking, is this government in a position to tell anyone to tighten up the belt, morally speaking, after the PPE scandal and everything?
Yeah.
That is why I think the president has to manage those political. The president has to remember the minister in Treasury prepares the president's budget. That is the president's budget, actually. The budget comes out is the president's budget to fund priorities. So even if the president did not come forth as supporting Minister Tito Mboweni, the president has a few times reiterated the need to follow that document. I remember after the COVID financial injection, you remember the money we got from the World Bank, and the Fitch came and we were being told we are not doing so well. The COVID is making things, but remember, we were not doing so well economically even before the COVID. The debt was just a problem even before the COVID, and the COVID just put more expenditure along our way. I remember the president saying that, then we know what Treasury needs to do. We know what we need to do. So it is the president whom cannot be seen publicly siding with Treasury in that way, also because of politics. But certainly, I'm of the view that he had tried to give them the space to try to maneuver. I don't think the president did not see that document from Treasury before it went public. You know what I mean?
So
I don't think he saw it at the same time that you and I and Kosatu.
That's a good point to make. There's no way he could have seen that. There's no way it could have gone to public without him seeing it. I mean, this is...
You and I and Kosatu, Kosatu and the SACP might have seen that document after it hit the media, but I don't think I think that the president must have seen it and must have contributed to that before.
Yeah. Before it hit the power. I'm interested in your perspective here, Ralph. And you've just mentioned now that this radical economic transformation faction of the ANC, excuse me, the likes of Makashule, Carl Niehaus, and so on, they look a bit weaker now, because of all this that's been happening, that has been happening, including the ANC's decision to say that those who are implicated or who sort of their allegations, corruption allegations against them, that they step aside. Yeah. My observation is that the RT faction has become weaker now. Zuma is just out of jail. He had to be locked up. Carl Niehaus has been basically silenced. Ace Makashule, serious trouble as well. The general secretary of the ANC is a very powerful position in the party. Yeah, it's very, very powerful. Now, to have Ace Makashule in this awkward position he's in, it has weakened him, a bit, at least in my observation. My question is to you: is this RET faction, is it still a threat to Ramaphosa? In other words, does it still have to decide, thinking, okay, if I do this, these guys are going to try and dislodge me in the next conference. I need to sort of be careful on what I do, because, these guys will plot against me. Is this RT faction, is it still a big threat to Ramaphosa? at this point?
Certainly, and it has a potential to derail his bid for the second term within the ANC. Let's not be naive about that. I mean, you see, the champions of the RET, some have been facing problems and they are no longer at the center, the likes of Magashule. It doesn't mean that the group cannot try to find somebody else. I mean, I saw a very interesting report in City Press a while ago that they were saying that they were talking about someone else, the RET. I wasn't surprised because I had earlier thought, and I think somewhere else in the book I might be reflecting on it, that the greater risk Ramaphosa has is that he goes against his detractors, he fights. By the time he gets to the finishing line, he's so tired and someone just comes and take the baton and say, thank you very much, you did a good job. And that's a different person who might not be completely in line with his agenda. So there is always a power tussle. There is always an opportunity there. And the RET has lost the moral ground in the last few months. I mean, the July looting and everything else. And I mean, recently even holding the minister to hostage, all of these things have just morally weakened them even more if they are associated with that. I mean, the MKVA as well on that, because they're associated with that. I think that the president, though, should not be too comfortable with this. Anything can happen.
Now, let's talk about the opposition as we're about to close off now. You write about the opposition. Where do you do this? You do this in, just want to check here. Where do you do this? You do this in chapter 7, where you write, the title of the chapter is The Stumbling Opposition. That's where you analyze the opposition. And with the EFF, you seem to say these guys really, they're not good with coalitions. It's not going to work. They are disruptors. Wherever, where things have collapsed on coalitions, really, you can blame them for being a big chunk of those, of those downfalls of those coalitions. Can the EFF grow out of this? Some people have said the EFF has reached a ceiling. Will it continue to grow? Will it continue to grow as a party, the EFF?
I mean, you see the difficulty is that coalition requires what I call incremental politics. Incremental politics is whereby you have got 5 things you want to achieve. You realize it's impossible to get all of them across. You settle for 1 or 2 on an incremental basis, or those 5 things you can settle for 40% achievement across all of them, not all or nothing. The EFF strategy does not allow you to cooperate and make coalitions functional. The EFF strategy does not allow it to mature now, because their strategy is to disrupt, and it is to disrupt the system, and they've done a good job so far. But the problem is that to be a governing party that is responsible for something and account is different from someone who set themselves to disrupt. There is nothing wrong in what they are doing. I want to believe that in some areas of disruption, they've achieved a lot. Some things could have been done better, but is their method? And I think as young people, they've done better. But are they on a path to govern? Unless they shift their strategy from that of being disruption towards consolidation, maybe. If you want to consolidate disruption, it means that we will disrupt further and further, maybe at a bigger scale. But if you want to scale down on disruption to say, now I want to run these things, it means you're going to have to go into the system. And the EFF does not want to be part of the system. That's the challenge they're facing as well. How do you correct the system while you are denouncing it every day, and while the only way in which you can shape it is to go inside and work within? I think that's the dilemma they're facing. It's a genuine challenge. I'm not castigating them. Their politics works, but for them to want to govern, they might need to start changing some strategies to show that now they want to take responsibility and account for result of some of the system, including the imperfections of the system.
Now, the DA, in your book, and this is in various chapters, I noted this, you seem to point that the DA is, it at this point, it doesn't appear as a racial sort of party, that wants to embrace racial diversity and race-based policies. In chapter 10, the coalition conundrum, you write here, you are saying that this is on page 136. You are saying that, however, at its policy conference in 2020, the DA resolved to do away with race-based redress, citing how the policy has been abused by the ANC. This is where the DA gets it wrong. And you continue to say, the party seems to conclude that whatever the ANC has failed in is of no further interest to South Africans. Now, I just want to speak about race-based policy here a bit, Ralph. I'm on the side that argues that BE has enriched black tycoons who are largely affiliated with the ANC. It hasn't really helped the people on the ground, the poor people, and therefore we need policies that will aim to achieve exactly the idea of helping poor people on the ground, right? And my issue as well with sort of when you use race as a determinant for your programs is that you are going to end up, Ralph, putting a program to help a black child of a black doctor who grew up in Sandton with almost everything, went to a private school, went to the best university, went to Harvard University, came back to South Africa, and therefore now that child needs to get specific privileges, right, or preferences. But if you use the socioeconomic condition, you are saying, okay, the people who are going to benefit in the program are people who are basically right at the bottom, and most of them will be black people, Ralph, no doubt about that. But what we are doing is that we are eliminating that possibility of funding already well-off black people, and that is why I sort of understand where the DA doesn't say we're not going to help people. At least my understanding, they're saying that let's use the socioeconomic criteria, because if we use race, we'll end up enriching the tycoons, black tycoons, and kids who come from well-off families. So that's how I see this. But I mean, how does what do you think of what I'm saying, and how does the DA sort of evolve out of? How does it gain more support going forward?
I think they need to. If you think about joining politics sometimes in the future, because what we are outlining is actually what I say they should do. I mean, we need to affirm the impact of race on access to opportunities. We have to acknowledge that to start with. It means we are acknowledging what has happened. It's not just for historical purposes, but it's also because even going forward, race will determine access to opportunities. But as you're saying, we don't want to create the super black elite.
Yes.
When we talk about when we talk about transformation in the society, we need transformation, no doubt about it. Women, people with disabilities. The mere fact that the ANC couldn't get it right doesn't mean we cannot talk about it. The DA is not offering an alternative. You are offering an alternative. They are not doing it. They are not interested in making sense. Yes. They are interested in taking a political posture.
By the way, my friend, what I've just told you now, I've told some of them again. They're the people of the DA.
Yes, because that is exactly what I share with you. I have said that I've studied affirmative action for many years. If you go to court, you look at the court cases on affirmative action, the court is very clear about what it requires. The policy has to be rational, thought about. It requires such a complex policy that if you can devise such a policy, you are going to offend people less. You cannot just tell us that you want to bring about 10 black doctors and therefore you cannot employ 10 white, and that's affirmative action. And someone who's criticizing that should not go out and say that you see what transformation is doing. No, that is the ANC's version. Bring your own version. The DA seems to believe South Africa is beyond transformation. That's where the problem is. That is what I'm going at in that chapter to say. Reformulate ideas. Let us move on. I'm critical of black economic empowerment. the way in which it has been implemented, but give me an alternative to think forward.
Yes, I
You
mean,
cannot say because somebody failed. Yes, you cannot say because somebody failed at it, suddenly the debate is closed. That's what I see as difficult and tenable on the side. I don't think the DA is interested in making sense around race.
Yeah. Now, let's wrap up now. I want to ask you about, just by the way, to remind the people, this is Dr. Ralph Mathekga's book, The ANC's Last Decade, How the Decline of the Party Will Transform South Africa. Very, very informative book. I really enjoyed reading it. In fact, Ralph, I've just finished writing my my column for this week for Politics Web, where it appears, where I review your book. So I just need to edit it later and send to the editor. And then I will share with you and my followers as well. But Ralph,
some issues I'll only address in the next book.
Yeah, you see.
Thank you.
But Ralph, my question is this, my brother: how do you see these local elections? How will the ANC do here in these local government elections?
You know, when people go to the elections, there must be a sense of agenda. There must be a sense of expectation. This is the election where I think a lot of us were just going there for the democratic ritual of it. But there is no sense of expectations. Why? The ANC does not expect to grow. It expects to hold on slightly on the margin. The DA has got no strategy to grow. They've been shrinking. They expect to hold on the margin. The EFF will take whatever comes out of the election. They did not promise anyone anything going into the election. They did not promise anyone that they will grow tremendously, but they will not decline. It's one party that is growing on the margin. And the EFF is not about to grow to a point where it forms government. So for me, if I were to use the term or a phrase to characterize this election, I'll use one word, or maybe I'll use three words. Fragmentation, fragmentation, fragmentation.
Fragmentation, yeah.
We are in the era of political fragmentation in South Africa. We are experiencing the emergence of multiple centers. This election showed that there are more independent candidates. They represent further fragmentation. They don't represent consolidation.
Yeah. Oh, no, and it's quite interesting times. We shall see how things play out. Thank you so much, Ralph. It's a pleasure to talk to you, sir, about your book. I mean, yeah, it's very informative. I saw you have Stephen Grootes here. Grootes, the guy who's one of the, he wrote the foreword for this book. He's on SAFM, if I'm not mistaken, at the moment.
Yeah,
the morning show there. So
I get to talk to him a lot. So discussing a lot of things.
Yeah,
you know, mornings and so forth. So a lot of the discussion come from and I think I've acknowledged the discussions. I mean, the points come from the discussion I have with a lot of journalists, you guys, analysts, journalists, and all of us. And I'm very grateful.
Because you get ideas as you speak to all these people. So So thank you so much, my friend. Hopefully we'll chat soon about your new book, the next one that you will write. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.